Today we are off to Edinburgh, but before we go, I want to tell you something about my relationship with Edinburgh. You see, I grew up in North Lanarkshire, which is closer to Glasgow. This means that Edinburgh, when I was growing up, was less a real place and more a concept. A city-shaped idea that existed somewhere to the east. Mystical, grand, faintly formal. Glasgow was home. Edinburgh was that place you knew existed, the way you know Paris exists. Impressive, slightly intimidating, but not somewhere you expect to find yourself on a Tuesday afternoon. The first time I ever actually went to Edinburgh, I was about 20 years old, and by that time I was a police officer, fairly new, still fairly young, and still at a stage where every experience feels significant. And the reason I was in Edinburgh was that I had to attend court. As a witness, I should say that immediately, I was not the accused. Though the state I was in trying to find the court, someone might have been forgiven for thinking otherwise. I had no map, no smartphone, because, well, they hadn't been invented yet, and no sat-nav, nothing. I had the vaguest idea of an address, I had a train ticket, and the entirely misplaced confidence of a 20-year-old who hadn't yet learned properly to be afraid of things that she didn't know. I ended up having to ask strangers for directions, repeatedly, all the way from Waverley Station to the court. And here's where it gets interesting, because Edinburgh is Scotland's most popular tourist destination. It receives millions of visitors every year. People come from all over the world, specifically to be in this city. And the significant number of people I stopped also had absolutely no idea where I was going. We were lost together in Scotland's most visited city. A young police officer and a rotating cast of international tourists, collectively baffled by Edinburgh's street layout. And I say international tourists purposely, because Edinburgh draws visitors from everywhere, and not everyone I approached that day spoke English. Or, at the very least, not everyone I approached understood Glaswegian. It was one of the two, and I genuinely can't tell you which one. What I can tell you is that the combination of my accent, my urgency, and an address I was reading off a piece of paper produced some expressions of very genuine confusion on both sides of the conversation. The good news is, I did eventually find people who knew where I was going and could understand me well enough to say so. Edinburgh came through for me that day, and I got there, court appearance intact, and I just want that noted before we get into the Glasgow comparisons. After the court was done that day, I was standing outside, feeling fairly relieved, fairly exhausted, and more than a little bit nervous about the prospect of finding my way back to the train station, when one of my colleagues appeared. Noting the relieved look in my face, he asked if everything was okay. And when I told him that I'd got completely lost on my way to the court, because it was actually my first time in Edinburgh, and I was a bit worried about finding my way back to the train station, they looked at me with that particular baffled expression of someone who's just heard something that they can't quite process. They were genuinely shocked that I, a person from less than 45 minutes away from Edinburgh, had reached the ripe old age of 20 without once ever having been to Edinburgh. In fact, they were appalled, and they marched me straight up to see the castle. I saw it from the outside only. We didn't go in, but they walked me to where you could see it properly. This enormous medieval castle, sitting on a volcanic rock above the city, lit up, completely impossible to miss. And I looked at it and thought, how on earth did I not see that on my way here? The answer, in my defence, is that I was 20 years old, navigating an unfamiliar city, all alone, with no map, and asking foreign tourists for directions, on the way to give evidence in the highest court in the land for what was the first time. I was not, at that particular moment, in a position to notice anything, even architecture of that scale. It is, I appreciate, an impressive thing to have missed, a giant medieval castle on a volcano in the middle of a city, but I maintain that the circumstances were extenuating, and I want that on the record. Since that first court-related visit, I have been to Edinburgh many times. I know the castle fairly well, and I'll come to that. I know the Royal Mile, and its closes and its layers. I love the cobblestones and the ghost stories, and that particular quality of the old town on a grey day when the mist is sitting low and the closes are dripping and the whole place looks like every Gothic novel ever written. Edinburgh on a grey day is Edinburgh at its most Edinburgh. But I also know this. I am more Glaswegian than Edinburgher, and that shapes how I see the city. I see it with love, genuine love, and with the faintest trace of an outsider's eye. And I think, actually, that is the most useful way to show it to you. I'm Lesley Kennedy, this is Everything Scotland, and today we're off to Edinburgh. Before anything else, we're going to talk about the pronunciation, because this comes up constantly, so I can't possibly let it go unaddressed. It's not Edinburgh, it's not Edinburgh, it's not Edinburgh, and it's not, and I say this with the greatest affection for my American listeners, Edinburgh. It's Edinburgh. The last syllable rhymes with duh, as in the noise you make when you realise you've been mispronouncing it all along. Edinburgh. The burg part at the end is Scots, from the Old English word for a fortified place, and it's pronounced bruh in Scotland, regardless of what it looks like written down. Edinburgh, Edinburgh. Say it a few times, it'll start to feel more natural within the week. I have corrected this pronunciation in tours more times than I can count, and I'll never stop correcting it. Consider this your preemptive correction, delivered kindly but firmly at the start of the episode rather than at the end. You're very welcome. Right, now we've got that sorted, and before we go anywhere near the castle or the closes or the festival, I want to talk about the thing that every Scot has a view on and that tourists sometimes sense without quite being able to name. Glasgow and Edinburgh are only 45 miles apart, geographically. Culturally, however, they are considerably further. And I say this with complete affection for both cities, and I say it as someone who grew up much closer to Glasgow, and who therefore approaches Edinburgh with the slightly odd respect of someone visiting somewhere grander than where they came from. There is a very old joke in Scotland. In Edinburgh, when you go to visit someone, they will say, "So, you will have had your tea," which sounds friendly. It's not an invitation. It means we acknowledge that you have probably eaten, and therefore we are not required to feed you. You have had your tea. Good, wonderful, moving on. In Glasgow, the same visit goes, "So, you'll be wanting your tea," which is not a question, it's a statement. It means, sit down, you're eating, I'll put the kettle on, and if you try to leave before you've had something, I will be deeply offended. Now, I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying Edinburgh people are unfriendly. They're not, as my 20-year-old self and her frantic search for a courtroom can confirm. Edinburgh is welcoming. Edinburgh is hospitable. Edinburgh will absolutely help you find where you're going. Glasgow, however, will help you find where you're going, make sure you've eaten, insist you have a cup of tea, find out your whole life story, and tell you 3 of theirs. There is a warmth in Glasgow that is its own specific thing, and it is the thing I miss most when I'm not near it. Edinburgh has elegance, Glasgow has heart. Both cities are better for the comparison, and neither of them would agree with me for saying so, which is very on brand for Scotland. Glasgow will get its own full episode later, and I will not pretend I'm not looking forward to it. But today, it's Edinburgh, which has plenty going on for it, as you're about to find out. Castle Rock. A plug of volcanic basalt, sheer on 3 sides, that has been the most obvious place to build a fortress in this part of Scotland, since people in this part of Scotland first had the idea of building fortresses. You cannot miss it. You can see it from miles away. Unless, of course, you're a 20-year-old on their first trip to Edinburgh, completely lost with no idea of where they're going, but I think we covered that story. Sitting on Castle Rock is the castle itself, rising above the city with the particular authority of something that has been there for 1,000 years and has no intention of going anywhere. In recorded history, Edinburgh Castle has never been taken by frontal assault. Never. Over 1,000 years of Scottish history, sieges, English armies, Jacobite risings, every kind of conflict, and nobody has successfully stormed those walls from the front. The rock is simply too sheer, the approach too exposed. It has been taken by treachery, starvation, negotiation, but never direct attack. That is, by any measure, an extraordinary record. Inside and behind significant security are the honours of Scotland, the Scottish crown jewels, the crown, the sceptre and the sword of state. They are the oldest surviving royal regalia in the British Isles, older than the crown jewels in the Tower of London, and they were used to crown the monarchs of Scotland for centuries, including Mary Queen of Scots. They are not reproductions or ceremonial copies. They are the real thing. The crown that sat on Mary Queen of Scots' head is in a case in Edinburgh Castle, and you can stand 3 feet away from it. If that doesn't make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, I'm not sure what will. During Cromwell's occupation of Scotland in the 1650s, his forces were systematically seizing royal regalia across Britain, melting it down, destroying it, eliminating the physical symbols of monarchy. The honours were in serious danger. So, a group of people walled them up inside a castle vault and told nobody. They were not seen again for over a century. Through the entire reign of Charles II, through the Act of Union, through the Jacobite risings, through the entire period of Scottish history we covered in episodes 2 through 5. Just sitting on a wall, completely undisturbed, waiting. In 1818, Sir Walter Scott, who we'll meet properly in the writers section, organised a search. They opened the vault. The chest was there. They lifted the lid, and the honours were inside, exactly as they had been left, in perfect condition, as if someone had simply popped out for a moment and was expected back shortly. They had been in that box, behind that wall, for 111 years. I have seen the honours many times. I've stood in front of them with guests, and people are always surprised not only by the age and the craftsmanship, but the connection to real people. The fact that Mary Queen of Scots has wore that crown on her head and held that sceptre never fails to surprise people. And there's always a suspicion that they're replicas, but they're absolutely not. And people are always wowed when they realise this. Alongside the honours, for many years, was the Stone of Destiny. And the stone has its own story, which is considerably more dramatic than a stone has any right to be. The stone is the ancient coronation stone on which Scottish kings were crowned for centuries. In 1296, Edward I of England, who was making a habit of taking things that didn't belong to him, seized it and took it to Westminster Abbey, where it sat under the coronation chair and was used in the coronation of every subsequent English and British monarch for 700 years. Every coronation, the same stone, same abbey, taken from Scotland in 1296 and not returned. That is, until 1950, when 4 Scottish university students decided they would take it back. On Christmas Day, 1950, Christmas Day chosen presumably because Westminster Abbey would be at its least attended, 4 students from Glasgow University broke into the Abbey. They removed the stone from underneath the coronation chair and drove it back to Scotland. The stone, which weighs approximately 152 kilograms, broke in 2 during the removal. They took it anyway, in 2 pieces, in the back of a car across the border. They had no particular plan beyond getting it back to Scotland. They were students. The plan was the heist. The aftermath was, in the great tradition of student plans, somewhat improvised. The stone was eventually recovered by police, left on the altar of Arbroath Abbey, of all places, wrapped in a Scottish flag, and it was returned to Westminster. The 4 students were never charged. The British government decided, apparently, that prosecuting 4 Scottish students for stealing back a Scottish stone from an English abbey on Christmas Day was not a public relations exercise they wished to pursue. Probably a very wise decision. The stone was officially returned to Scotland in 1996 to considerable ceremony. It was displayed in Edinburgh Castle for nearly 30 years, and in 2024 it was moved to its permanent new home at Perth Museum. Perth being the ancient capital of Scotland, and most would argue exactly where it belongs. There is one more detail about the stone that Scotland has quietly enjoyed for centuries. There are historians who argue, with considerable evidence and even more enthusiasm, that Edward I got the wrong stone in 1296 to begin with, that the real stone of destiny was hidden before he arrived and a lump of plain sandstone substituted in its place, meaning that every English and British monarch since 1296 has been crowned over a piece of ordinary Scottish rock, while the real thing sat somewhere else entirely, laughing. Scotland has never confirmed or denied this. Scotland has simply let the question sit there, unanswered, for 700 years, because Scotland enjoys a good ongoing argument, and this is one of the finest it has ever had. Every day at exactly 1 o'clock, that is, every day except Sundays, Good Friday and Christmas Day, the 1 o'clock gun fires from Edinburgh Castle, a single cannon shot, loud enough to carry across the city and far out over the Forth. It has been fired since 1861, originally as a time signal for the ships in the Firth of Forth to set their chronometers. The ships no longer need it. Edinburgh fires it anyway. Some traditions exist beyond their original purpose and are simply better for it. I want to talk a little about the 1 o'clock gun, because no description of it fully prepares you for the reality of it. It is loud, profoundly, viscerally, unreasonably loud. Not loud in the way that a car backfiring is loud, but loud in the way that rearranges something in your chest cavity that reminds you that your body still has a startle reflex, whether you like it or not. I have heard the 1 o'clock gun fire many times. I know it's coming. I know the exact time it will happen. I have stood there, fully prepared, watching the clock, knowing with complete certainty that in approximately 30 seconds a cannon will fire. And it still makes me jump. Every single time, without fail. There's something about the actual noise, the physical impact of it in the air, that bypasses rational knowledge entirely and goes straight to the part of the brain that is still, at some level, living in the 11th century and not expecting artillery. What I love most though, and I genuinely love this, is the crowd dynamic around the gun at 5-1. Because what happens is this. A group of people who know about the gun gather in the area beforehand, waiting for it. They are prepared. They have been told. Some of them have heard it before and are there specifically to watch what happens next. And scattered around the rest of the castle, going about their day, looking at the views, reading their maps, are the tourists who have absolutely no idea. 1 o'clock arrives. The gun fires. The prepared crowd flinches away, because knowledge is no defence against that noise. It never is. And the unprepared tourists, and I have seen this more times than I can count, react as if the castle itself has just declared war. There are people who grab their companions, people who drop things, people who look wildly around trying to identify the source of the noise and what the appropriate response to it might be. One particularly memorable occasion involved a gentleman near the esplanade who left the ground entirely, just briefly airborne. He was fine. He was also, I think, reconsidering his holiday choices. So if you visit Edinburgh Castle, be near the gun at 1 o'clock. Stand with the people who know it is coming. Watch the faces of the people who don't. It is, I promise you, one of the finest free entertainments the city provides. And Edinburgh provides quite a lot of entertainment, most of it unintentional. From the castle, the Royal Mile runs east. One Scots mile, slightly longer than an English mile, which is very characteristically Scottish, and all the way to the Palace of Holyrood House. And branching off on both sides are the closes and wynds, the narrow, steep, dark alleyways that were once the circulatory system of an entire medieval city, crammed onto a ridge. This is what I love most about the old town, the closes. Every single one of them has a story. Some of them are so narrow you could touch both walls simultaneously, and they run between buildings that in the 17th century rose to 14 stories. The world's first high-rise apartments, centuries before anyone used that phrase, built because the city couldn't expand outwards, so it simply kept going up. Walk into a close off the Royal Mile and you're immediately in a different Edinburgh. Quiet, darker, the sound of the tourist streets behind you muffled within a few steps. The cobblestones are uneven, the walls are close. There is moss in the stonework that has been there a long time. You feel, in the truest possible sense, that you are walking through history. Not a sanitised version of it, but the real thing, worn and damp and specific. And then there are the ghost stories. Every close has one. Edinburgh has more documented ghost stories per square mile than almost any city in the world, which is either because it is genuinely one of the most haunted places on earth, or because it has been very good at cultivating the reputation. And honestly, I'm not sure the distinction matters. On a dark November evening, with the Hare rolling in, and we'll come to Hare, the old town of Edinburgh requires absolutely no theatrical assistance to feel like somewhere a ghost might reasonably choose to spend their time. Below the Royal Mile, literally below it, sealed under the foundations of a building constructed in the 1750s, is Mary King's Close, a complete medieval street, its residents relocated when the building above was constructed. The close itself preserved by accident in the dark. For nearly 200 years, nobody went there. When it was rediscovered, the everyday objects of the 17th century Edinburgh were still in place. You can visit it today, walking streets that have not seen daylight since the 1700s. It's one of the strangest and most quietly affecting experiences in Scotland. By the mid-18th century, Edinburgh was bursting. The Old Town Ridge was overbuilt, overcrowded, and by all accounts, not tremendously pleasant to live on. The city's leading citizens, who were, by this point, some of the greatest minds in Europe, because we are now firmly in the Scottish Enlightenment, which we'll speak about some other time, wanted somewhere that reflected the age of reason, rather than the age of open sewers emptied from 14-storey windows. In 1766, the Town Council held a competition for the new town plan. The winner was James Craig. He was 22 years old. His design? A clean, elegant grid with wide streets and a square at each end is what you see today. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, alongside the old town it was built to escape from. Edinburgh kept both. Of course it did. Edinburgh does not throw things away. And I want to reiterate that the new town was built in the 18th century. It is, by the standards of most countries and most cities, extremely old. In Scotland, however, anything constructed after the medieval period is still essentially considered new, and 18th century is practically yesterday. The old town dates to the 11th century and beyond. Against that backdrop, 1766 is basically last week. Scotland operates on a timescale that makes the rest of the world feel slightly impatient, and that is entirely intentional. To connect the two worlds, the Nor Loch, the body of water sitting between the old ridge and new development, which had been Edinburgh's dumping ground for several centuries and was accordingly unpleasant, was drained. The excavated earth was piled up to create the mound, an artificial hill that connects old and new towns today. Edinburgh built a hill to bridge its two halves. This, I think, is a metaphor for something, though I'm not entirely sure what. The finest piece of the new town is Charlotte Square, designed by Robert Adam in 1791. The entire north side conceived as one grand architectural composition. Individual houses presenting as a palace. The Enlightenment idea made physical. Individual parts arranged so the whole becomes greater than any of them. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most beautiful squares in Britain. Edinburgh, of course, knows this, although it doesn't like to mention it. That would just be vulgar. No city produces writers so shaped by their city as Edinburgh does. The place gets into the writing in a way that's difficult to explain, but easy to feel if you have read the books and walked the streets. Let me introduce you to 5 of the ghosts. Robert Louis Stevenson, born in 1850 in Heriot Row in the New Town. A sickly child, bedridden for much of his childhood, looking out at lamp-lit streets and imagining the world beyond them. He grew up in a city of radical duality. Respectable Georgian New Town, shadowy medieval Old Town. In 1886 he published The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It is set in London. It feels like Edinburgh. The fog, the gaslight, the respectable surface concealing something darker underneath. Stevenson left Scotland as a young man and spent most of his life abroad. Ultimately, Samoa, where he died at 44. He always carried Edinburgh with him. You can feel it in every page. Sir Walter Scott, the most influential Scottish writer who ever lived. He invented the historical novel in its modern form. He gave Scotland back to itself, wrote its history into stories the whole world read. He organised the visit of George IV to Edinburgh in 1822, the full tartan pageant that rehabilitated Highland culture, while simultaneously writing novels at a pace that modern publishers would consider alarming. The Scott Monument on Princes Street is 61 metres tall and is the largest monument to a writer anywhere on earth. It is Gothic and slightly unhinged and entirely impossible to ignore. Like someone pointed a cathedral at the sky and told it to just keep going up. Edinburgh built this to commemorate a novelist. This tells you everything you need to know about how seriously Edinburgh takes its literary figures, and also possibly about Edinburgh's relationship with restraint. Arthur Conan Doyle, born in Edinburgh in 1859, trained as a doctor at Edinburgh University. Among his professors was a surgeon called Dr. Joseph Bell, who had the ability to observe a patient and deduce, within moments, their occupation, their habits, where they had recently been, and what ailments they carried. He would look at someone and say, "You've been in the army, returned recently from abroad, you work with horses and have a bad left knee." And he'd be right. Not as a party trick, as a diagnostic method. Conan Doyle took Joseph Bell, moved him to Baker Street, called him Sherlock Holmes, and gave him a friend called Watson. The most famous fictional detective is an Edinburgh doctor. There is a statue of Sherlock Holmes near Doyle's birthplace in the city, a monument to a fictional character based on a real person in the city where the real person worked. Edinburgh considers this entirely reasonable. Irvine Welsh. Trainspotting was published in 1993, set in Leith, the port at the foot of Edinburgh. The working class district the Georgian city preferred not to think about too much. Written in phonetic Scots and depicting the heroin epidemic of the 1980s with brutal and darkly funny clarity. Welsh showed the Edinburgh that the tourist board tried to hide. Edinburgh always had two faces, and Welsh was one of the first writers honest enough to photograph both, simultaneously, and put them in the same book. J.K. Rowling. wrote the early Harry Potter novels in Edinburgh cafes in the 1990s. A single mother who could afford a cup of tea and a warm place to sit and write. The Elephant House on George IV Bridge being one of her cafes of choice. Look out of its back window and you see Greyfriars Kirkyard, the old graveyard, with 17th century headstones bearing names that appear in the books. McGonagall, Moody, Potter. Edinburgh's Dead named her characters. She gave the world its most beloved fictional school, designed above a Scottish graveyard, where she went to write because it was warm and she could afford a cup of tea. Let's not forget that Edinburgh has a dark side, which is substantial. In 1828, two Irish immigrants, William Burke and William Hare, committed 16 murders and sold the bodies to an Edinburgh anatomy school. Body snatching was already a well-established profession in Edinburgh by this point. The city's world-leading medical schools needed cadavers that legal supply couldn't really meet, and graveyards had taken to installing iron cages called mort safes over fresh graves to protect them. And you can still see mort safes in Greyfriars Kirkyard today. Burke and Hare simply removed the middleman. Why wait for someone to die when you can take a more proactive approach to the whole situation? Now, as a former police officer, I can tell you that the driving motivation behind Burke and Hare is not, in my professional experience, that unusual. People will steal almost anything if there's a pound or two in it for them. Burke and Hare simply took that principle further than most. The anatomy school paid well. The supply of fresh bodies via natural means was unreliable. They identified a gap in the market and filled it with a dedication that, in any other context, would be described as entrepreneurial. Now, I want to be clear, just because I understand the motivation, it does not mean I endorse the approach. Burke and Hare were eventually caught, as it happens, in the most unremarkable way imaginable. A couple lodging in Hare's house discovered a body hidden under the bed, and they reported it. The police arrived. Burke and Hare, faced with the evidence, turned on each other immediately, which, in my professional experience, is what tends to happen when people who have been doing terrible things together are suddenly in a room with the police. Solidarity does have its limits. Hare took the deal and testified against Burke. Burke took the consequences. Burke was hanged in 1829 before a very large crowd. Edinburgh never missed a good public spectacle, and his body was then publicly dissected in the anatomy theatre. There is a certain justice in this that I suspect Edinburgh appreciated. His skeleton is still on display at the Edinburgh Medical School. Hare turned King's evidence and was released. He disappears from recorded history afterwards. History, occasionally, is tactful. The Burke and Hare case directly led to the Anatomy Act of 1832, which created a legal framework for medical dissection and transformed surgical training worldwide. Edinburgh's darkness, as so often, produced the world's progress. This is a pattern in this city. And then, because Edinburgh will not leave you entirely bleak, there is Greyfriars Bobby. I love the story of Greyfriars Bobby, genuinely. A little Skye Terrier who, in the 1860s, allegedly guarded the grave of his owner, John Gray, in Greyfriars Kirkyard for 14 years until his own death in 1872. Loyal beyond death, devoted beyond reason, the most faithful dog in Scottish history. It's a beautiful story, and I believe it completely. What I do not believe in is what has happened to the statue since. There is a small bronze statue of Bobby outside the kirkyard, and people rub his nose for luck. Everyone rubs his nose for luck. Thousands of people, every day, rubbing this poor wee dog's nose on the grounds that it will bring them good fortune. Bobby was a Skye Terrier. He is not a lucky charm. He is a memorial to a faithful dog, and he deserves better than to have his nose worn smooth by the collective superstition of international tourists. If people keep going at it, he'll eventually cease to be a Skye Terrier and probably become a pug. And I cannot think of a less dignified way for one of the great dogs of Scottish history to end up. Please stop rubbing his nose. Leave poor Bobby in peace. He's earned it. Every August, Edinburgh loses the plot entirely. It doubles in size, turns itself inside out, and becomes, for 4 weeks, the cultural capital of the world. It started in 1947 as a carefully curated international festival of classical music and theatre. 8 companies who weren't selected decided they were going to perform anyway, in church halls, in pub back rooms, and wherever they could find a space. The Edinburgh Fringe was born as a gate crash, and it has been gate crashing ever since. And now it is considerably more famous than the party that it originally crashed. Today, over 3,500 shows, 300 venues, 3 million tickets, and anyone can perform. There's no addition, no curation, and no one to tell you that your one-man show about interpretive tax returns is perhaps not ready for a public audience. The quality range is, accordingly, spectacular in both directions. You can see the best theatre of your life at 2 o'clock and be genuinely baffled by what you paid for it for. You'll talk about them both for years, but you'll laugh about the bad one more. Now, I have been to the Edinburgh Festival many times, and I want to prepare you for it properly, because no amount of reading about it fully gets you there. It's busier than you think. You will think you have mentally prepared for the crowds. You have not. Edinburgh in August contains more people per square foot than any situation you have previously been in, and they are all moving in slightly different directions, while simultaneously carrying bundles of flyers. And it's stranger than you imagine. I stood in the Royal Mile for the best part of 15 minutes, watching a street performer doing something that I could not at any point during those 15 minutes fully classify. I'm not sure it belonged to any existing category of performance, but I was completely captivated. I still cannot tell you what it was. This is, I've come to understand, a completely normal festival experience. And it's not for the faint-hearted. And it is absolutely not for the easily affronted. You will see things in that street that you were not expecting. Some of them will be brilliant, some will be baffling, and some will make you want to avert your eyes and look somewhere else very quickly. You'll be talking about it all for a long time after you get home. And this is the festival. Go once and go curious. Leave your expectations at Waverley Station and collect them on your way back. So we've come to that point in the show where we're going to read the listener stories. These keep coming in and every single one of them is a pleasure to read. Keep sending them. So the first one is from Caroline in Toronto. And Caroline says, I visited Scotland with my sister 3 years ago. We had a huge list of things that we were going to see during our 4 days in the country. Turns out Scotland is much bigger in person than it is on a map. Needless to say, we barely made it through half of the things on our list. Most of it remained untouched and is still growing year by year. I'm sure we'll get back to it eventually. Caroline, I know exactly how that goes. As a tour guide, people contact me all the time with a huge list of things that they want to see and only a tiny amount of time to see it all in. And they sometimes seem a bit disappointed when I tell them it's not possible. Maybe now they'll know I'm not making that up. And then we have Bill from Tennessee. And Bill says, we came to Scotland for the whisky. There was myself, my dad and my son. The whole plan was distillery tours, drink Highland single malts, fly home happy. Simple. Except on day 3, when our guide dropped us off at our accommodation in a small village that I can't even remember the name of, we decided we were going to take a stroll along to the local pub. And that's where things got bad. We got into company with a couple of old guys in the bar and started drinking along with them. Thinking that as Tennessee boys we would be able to keep up, we matched them drink for drink. We sat in that pub for at least 3 hours and I'll be honest, none of us wanted to leave. However, the next day we missed our distillery entirely. We also missed breakfast, lunch and dinner. But I honestly don't regret any of it, not even slightly. Bill, the man who came for the whiskey and got ambushed by the locals in the pub. I love it. That's Scotland doing exactly what Scotland does. And for the record, missing a distillery session for a night like that was probably the absolute correct decision. I'd have probably made the same call. And that brings us now on to our Scots word of the week. And this week it's Hare. H-A-A-R. Hare. The cold sea fog that rolls in off the Firth of Forth, often without warning, sometimes very fast. You can be standing in the sunshine on Grassmarket, and within 20 minutes a wall of grey has come up from the east and Edinburgh has become a Gothic novel. The castle disappears, the closes drip, the streetlights come on in the afternoon, and the whole city reveals its oldest, most atmospheric face. Hare is not comfortable. It's cold and damp and slightly eerie. It's also Edinburgh being its most dramatically authentic self. If you want to understand what Robert Louis Stevenson was actually writing about when he set Jekyll and Hyde in the fog, go to Edinburgh on a hard day and walk down one of the closes from the Royal Mile. You'll understand within 30 seconds. You may also want to walk slightly faster. The closes feel different when the Hare is in. Next week on Everything Scotland, we're going somewhere that affects a remarkable number of you personally, whether you know it or not. We're going to be talking about the Scottish clans, the tartans, the feuds, the fierce loyalties, and the system of kinship that defined Highland life for centuries. Why the clans rose for Bonnie Prince Charlie, what happened to them after Culloden, and, because this is the question I get asked most often on tour by visitors from America and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, why does my surname sound Scottish and what does that mean? If your name is MacDonald, Campbell, Fraser, Mackenzie, Stewart, Murray, Ross, Grant, Hamilton, or any one of hundreds of others, next week's episode is going to tell you things about your own family history that you may not have known. And if your name is none of those things, it's still going to be one of the most fascinating episodes of the series. The clan system in Scotland at its most complicated, its most loyal, its most feuding, and its most human. I cannot wait to get into it. So before I go, I just wanted to have a wee word. If you're enjoying Everything Scotland, and I genuinely hope that you are, I'd love it if you could subscribe wherever you're listening. It costs nothing, it means you never miss an episode, and it helps more people find the podcast. And if you're feeling generous, leave a wee review on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, wherever suits you. Reviews matter more than most people realise, and every single one is appreciated. You can also find Everything Scotland on social media. We are at Everything Scotland Official across Instagram and Facebook, and at Everything Scotland on YouTube. Come and say hello. Share the episodes that resonate with you. Send me your stories, because as you heard, those stories are some of the best things about making this podcast, and I genuinely want to hear more of them. And if someone in your life loves Scotland, or is about to visit, or has just come back, or simply needs something good to listen to, share this podcast with them. That's how Everything Scotland grows, and it grows one Scotland lover at a time. I'm Lesley Kennedy. This is Everything Scotland. Slán